Hey guys, what's up? My name is Public, and today I'm bringing you the Legion patch 7.1.5 guide for Shadow Priest. So I'm going to go over all things Shadow related for raid content, mainly PvE stuff, right? I'm not going to do a whole lot of Mythic Plus stuff in this video, but I will have a future video specifically covering Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus later on. So before we get started, there were a lot of changes that happened between 7.1 and 7.1.5. If you haven't seen all of those changes, I did a video documenting all of these a couple weeks back before the patch was released, so feel free to check that out if you want. I didn't want to cover that in this video just because there is a lot, so I'll touch on some of the nuances in the talent section and in the rotation section, but outside of that, my other video will cover that stuff. Alright, so the first thing that I'm going to cover, if you haven't seen my other videos, is just kind of a basic Shadow Priest 101, so how the spec works and things like that. So the basics of the spec is essentially instead of using mana to cast spells like other ranged casters, we have a resource called Insanity. And essentially this functions similar to a few other like melee specs and energy in a few different ways, but the idea is you build up Insanity to a point and then you go into Void form at a certain level of that Insanity, and while you're in Void form you do a lot more damage, have access to new abilities, and that kind of thing. So the main goal of the Shadow Priest is all around this new mechanic Void form that hasn't been with us before. And the idea with it is to essentially get in it and stay in it as long as possible to get the most damage out and the most DPS out. And so I'm going to kind of cover how to do that and how to maximize that in a raiding environment for damage and just in general playability in raids right now. So with that being said, I'm going to cover just what Shadow Priest is good at. Right now, Shadow Priest is pretty good at a lot of things. We're pretty strong in Mythic Plus, and we're pretty strong in raids, which is great. We're not necessarily top of the damage meters on every single fight like we used to be, but we are super competitive for sure on every single fight and encounter type. With that being said, our main strengths come in multi-target, cleave, and sustain damage, which is good because Nighthold, specifically the new raid that just came out, has a lot of those fights. The only ones that we're going to kind of not be super far ahead, at least with current gear levels, is single target. We'll still be pretty competitive towards the top end, but we're not going to be smashing, destroying everyone. And I'll kind of cover which talents help us do these things, but the nice thing is the class still scales very well. So as we get more gear, as we get our tier bonuses and legendaries and that kind of thing, our power goes up pretty substantially. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about talents. So again, I'm specifically wanting to talk about talents that are used in a raiding environment, PvE style. So I'm not going to cover anything really PvP based. That's not my specialty, it's not what I'm good at. So I'm going to ignore that for now. So we'll start out with the level 15 row, and I'm just going to go over all the talents and if they are usable in raids in the current state. So level 15 row, our only real option here is Twist of Fate. Fortress of the Mind could see some use on pure single target encounters, but that isn't really a thing with Nighthold. Even a fight like Croesus or Star Augur has adds to help us proc Twist of Fate. So for every encounter in the Nighthold, I recommend taking Twist of Fate as your level 15 talent. Now level 30 talents, we have some choice here, but it's mainly just preferential. Same thing with level 45 row. I prefer taking Body and Soul on most things for level 30 talents. However, Mania could see some use. I've been kind of experimenting with it a little bit. They did buff the amount of movement speed we get from it, so something to play around with, but I think the on cooldown or the burst movement speed you get with Body and Soul is pretty nice. And on the level 45 row, again, this is more preference than anything, but I think Mind Bomb, in terms of its utility and things like that in raids and Mythic Dungeons, is good enough to be taken in every single scenario, in my opinion. So now the level 60 row, this is where we kind of have a bit more choice or options in our play. All three options could be used in the current state of things. In a raiding environment, you're going to see Lingering Insanity being used the most, and I'll kind of explain why that is as we get to the level 100 talent section. If you remember from my older videos, Lingering Insanity used to be something called Void Lord, and they work somewhat similarly, but Lingering Insanity used to be a baseline spell that has now been removed and has been replaced with the talent Lingering Insanity, which is kind of a combination of what it used to be and what Void Lord used to be, so it's kind of a mix and match of that, and I'll kind of explain why it's being used so much in just a second. The other options, Reaper's Souls is used strictly with Surrender to Madness, and this goes true even if you have the Legendary Cloak. All the testing that myself and others at howtopriest.com have done have shown that Lingering Insanity still kicks a lot of butt, even with the Legendary Cloak that modifies Shadow or Death. I'll cover some of the other Legendary nuances towards the end as well. Now the third option is Void Ray, which hasn't really seen much use this expansion. It was used back in the last expansion. We saw some changes with it, mainly its interaction with Mind Flay now that Mindseer is a passive of Mind Flay. So I haven't experimented with it too much. I personally just find Lingering Insanity to be very good overall, and that's what I default to. But in some Mythic dungeon cases, you might see Void Ray used, so kind of experiment with that if you're curious. But I think otherwise, Lingering Insanity should be your go-to in almost every case. So then we have our level 75 road. This is again we have another option here that we didn't used to have. Auspicious Spirits did get nerfed slightly. That coupled with some of the changes to Surrender to Madness, you're not going to see Auspicious Spirits as heavily as we did in the other raids, Emerald Nightmare and Trials of Valor. It's just not as strong as it used to be. Something we have seen though is with the other changes, this has given San Lan a lot more room to shine. So you kind of see two paths that Shadow Priests are going right now. One is an AS focus build, Auspicious Spirits focus build, where they're kind of favoring crit over mastery. And the other build is the San Lan build, where they're favoring mastery over crit. I'll kind of talk about stats and that distribution after rotation and that kind of thing. But for my personal views, by getting the tier set bonuses and gear that we're going to get from Nighthold level stuff, San Lan is just going to outscale Auspicious Spirits. Now that being said, a lot of you will probably have a lot of haste crit gear that we use from Emerald Nightmare, Trials of Valor, and that kind of thing that you've already had. So your crit levels might be like above 20-25%. If that's the case, switching to San Lan might actually be a DPS loss at that point because you're so favorable into Auspicious Spirits. But by switching your gear to more haste mastery stuff, you're going to notice San Lan just outscaling it quite heavily. So I would say, if you have crit above about 6,000 or so, go ahead and just play Auspicious Spirits for now, but you want to keep gearing towards San Lan because as you get into Mythic Nighthold or Heroic Nighthold or wherever your progression is at, you're going to see San Lan just perform better with that kind of gear. Now, if you're kind of like hovering around that 6k crit level and you're like, I'm not sure what to do, I have like 5.5k crit. Well, at that point, Auspicious Spirits and San Lan are going to perform quite equal, especially before you get the 4-piece. So a lot of it's just kind of toss up in the air. So like I said, I'll cover more of that in the weights discussion. For me personally, I'm using San Lan in that build. I'm seeing amazing numbers both on single target, multi-target, and that kind of thing. And I think it's in general just a more consistent and reliable way to play the class, which I really value. Now the third option here is Shadowy Insight. Shadowy Insight could see some use with the Legendary Belt. However, in the testing that I've done and the other theory crafters and How to Priest, it's really not worth it over the other two options. Even on pure single target, it still has its problems. So if you have the Legendary Belt, I would still use San Lan or AS, one of the two based on your stats. So now we're going to get into the level 90 row. This used to be something that was dominated solely by Power Infusion and nothing else was taken. Which is still kind of the case for a raiding environment. That really hasn't changed a whole much. Power Infusion is just an amazing cooldown, helps our single target quite substantially, and I think, in my opinion, should be used in every raid encounter that we have currently in Nighthold. Misery is the other option that some people do use to a decent effect. My only point I'll make about Misery is that what it's doing is when you cast Vampiric Touch, it automatically applies Shadow or Pain to the target. So what that's really doing is just saving you one global cooldown per mob that you're going to put your dots up. Whereas Power Infusion, if you have your dots up already and cast it, Power Infusion's damage just scales a lot faster. So I think with practice and that kind of thing and getting used to the timings, you're going to see a lot better results with Power Infusion. Now that being said, Misery could have some use if you're just learning the class or if you're doing maybe Mythic Plus or that kind of thing. So it's definitely on the back burner. And unfortunately, Mindbender just isn't seeing use right now. It just lacks any AoE component with it, and its single target is vastly outclassed by Power Infusion. So that really is not an option for raiding right now. And now we get into the level 100 talent row, and Blizzard essentially gave us exactly what we asked for to a certain degree. We have options. So previously Shadow was pigeonholed into only really taking Surrender to Madness builds if you wanted to really compete in raiding environments. That is no longer the case. Shadow Priests are equally, if not better, competitive with the other options than just taking Surrender to Madness now. So if you were kind of in the boat where I like the Void Form style of play, but I didn't like how reliant the class was on Surrender to Madness, then you're set. Legacy of the Void and Shadow Crash both have great potential for raiding as a level 100 raid talent. You're going to see most of logs and just good rankings and great progression pulls and that kind of thing using Legacy of the Void. This is, in my opinion, the go-to option for the level 100 row, and I highly recommend everyone kind of start with this as the option. It can scale very well. It's great for ad spawning because your Void form up times are pretty good. And it's all around just an amazing option, especially when you pair this with Lingering Insanity. You just come in and out of Void Form so fast, and your Void Form up times are really, really solid. Now, that being said, you could also use Shadow Crash as well, which is a little bit of a different twist on this. It used to be in the level 90 row, never saw any use, and now it's getting a lot more use with certain fights. So if you're doing a boss like Scorpiron or something like even Spellblade, for example, there are a lot of instances where things are stacked on top of each other, or maybe loosely spread around each other, where Shadow Crash is actually pretty decent. The one thing I'll say though is Shadow Crash is only a DPS increase if it hits the target. So that's something you kind of gotta be aware with Shadow Crash, is that if the target gets moved out of it, or if it dies before the cast lands, then you lost DPS, right? You could have been taking Legacy. So that's kind of the thing you have to decide there. In my personal opinion, I think Legacy just feels better. I like the rotation a little bit better, but both of them just are great options for Nighthold encounters. Now, the third option, which I said before, Surrender to Madness. Is this still being used anywhere? I said we had options. The answer is kind of. So on fights that are, very stacked targets or short durations or even really heavy movement, Surrender to Madness is going to actually outperform the other two options, assuming equal levels of play. So what do I mean by like short fights? Usually that's somewhere like below 3.5 minutes, something like that. Surrender to Madness will start to outscale Legacy and Shadow Crash. Now that being said, when it used to outscale those options, it did it by huge numbers, like several hundred K DPS. That's not really the case anymore. Legacy has been pretty close with that, even Shadow Crash to a certain extent, and it kind of just depends on the fight and your comfortability with it. The one fight that I'll highlight here that you might see this being used on maybe progression encounters and that type of thing is High Botanist. For the most part, towards the end execute phase, you'll have 3 targets up, and the targets are kind of scattered more heroic, but the idea is you'll have lots of stacked targets for a good chunk of the time, which makes playing with Surrender to Madness a lot easier, and easier to maintain those higher stacks. We're not necessarily able to get 120-second Void Forms on single target anymore, but on multiple targets we can still achieve those and get some pretty insane DPS out of that. So if you're in that really top end tier of playing, you can still get use out of Surrender to Madness, but it's definitely not as substantial as it used to be, so kind of take that with a grain of salt. So I've kind of gone over all the talents. Real quick, let me recap the builds that I recommend for most players for raid environments. I'd say you want to take Twist of Fate, Body and Solar Mania, Mind Bomb, Lingering Insanity as my go-to, preferably Sand Land over Auspicious Spirits, Power Infusion on almost every fight, and Legacy of the Void. This is probably going to be your default, setup for every single fight in Nighthold, and it can work in every single fight in Nighthold. You don't need to change a single one of those options. Now, if you want to go Shadow Crash, that doesn't really change anything else I just said. You just switch Legacy and Shadow Crash, and that's about it. I would say avoid taking Misery. It's kind of just a free talent. I don't think you get a whole lot of benefit out of it, but it can see some use on a few fights. And then the Surrender to Madness build actually hasn't changed much from what we saw earlier. You're still comparing it with the other two builds. You're going to want to take Reaper of Souls over Lingering Insanity. And between AS and Sand Land, you kind of want to say, how good can I be with this? AS is definitely going to help you stay in void form longer, but if you can get away with taking Sandland, the damage output is going to ramp up a lot better with that, even at a bit lower stacks. So it's kind of a toss up there in my opinion, so kind of go with your gut there. Power Infusion is still pretty much mandatory with Surrender, with that being said. Alright guys, so that kind of covers the talents, and stay tuned for the gearing section in just a second where I'll go over, how to get the most out of those builds, alright? Alright, so now I'm going to go over the rotation. So if you've been playing Shadow Priest since the expansion launched, pretty much nothing's really changed at all. I'll kind of go over this real quick again for those that haven't, played a Shadow Priest before. You're just now trying it out. But it's pretty much, instead of following, an XYZ rotation, it's following a priority list based on what comes off cooldown when. And I'm going to break this up into two kind of sub-rotations. One of them when you're out of void form, and the other one when you're in void form. And hopefully the graphics coming up can help illustrate this a little bit better than just me talking about them. So the first step in the rotation segment is just the out of void form stuff. So when you're not in void form, your goal is to generate insanity and get in void form as fast as you can. Now if you're taking Legacy of the Void, that means you can activate void form at 65 insanity. Don't need to wait any longer, just as soon as you can, get in it. If you're taking Shadow Crasher Surrender builds, that means you have to get to 100 insanity. So with that being said, your first priority is always going to be to cast Mind Blast. This is assuming kind of like a single target situation. Mind Blast is going to be your go-to here. Now as soon as you have more than 4 targets, Mind Blast will fall down a little bit, and I'll explain that in just a second. After Mind Blast, you're going to essentially keep up your dots on your target. You want to then use 1 charge of Shadow Word Death if it's available. You can't use Shadow Word Death if the target isn't in execute range. And then at last is just using your filler spell, which for us is pretty much going to be Mind Flay in most cases. Now, what I said earlier about the 4 target thing, if you're fighting 4 targets, the idea is you'll put your dots on just 1 target, or all of them if they already have it, no big deal. And then instead of using Mind Blast there, you'll want to use Mind Flay. That's where the damage starts to outscale from Mind Flay versus Mind Blast. Alright, and that's pretty much the rotation out of void form, and that's it. You really don't want to use any of your cooldowns in this state. You want to save all of those for once you're in void form. So you want to save Power Infusion, save Shadow Fiend, that kind of thing. Alright, so the second half of that is the in void form rotation. So with void form, we get 2 new abilities that we couldn't use before, which is Void Torrent, our artifact ability, and Void Bolt, one of our strongest hitting abilities that the spec currently has. So the priorities, you'll kind of notice that it's going to favor these pretty heavily. Your very first thing you want to do as soon as you get into void form is Void Torrent. That's your main priority here. After that, you want to use Void Bolt, then Mind Blast. Then you're going to use Shadow Word Death. But don't just go trigger happy on it. You don't just need to cast both charges at once, or immediately. You kind of just want to save it for the moments when you need it. But this is the time to use both charges instead of just holding off one. After that, you can dot new targets. Before, your dots really shouldn't be falling off with a Void Bolt unless you're heavily switching targets, but this is where you'll want to, if Mind Blast is off cooldown, Void Torrent's off cooldown, and Void Bolt's off cooldown, you kind of have the option of dotting new targets or casting Mind Flay. And since our dots hit so hard, usually you're going to want to say dots first. Now a question I get asked a lot is, how do I know when to cast these dots? And the biggest thing I can say is, if the target isn't going to live more than 5 to 10 seconds, it's probably just best to only cast Shadow Word Pain on those targets. If it's going to last considerably longer than that, so getting into 8, 9, 10, and especially above that, then you'd want to cast Vampiric Touch as well. And it's kind of going to be a practice kind of feeling that out and when to do that. It's not a clear-cut answer. It's just kind of a experience thing that you'll get as you play. Now one thing I haven't covered yet is where you're using your cooldowns to void form. So our 2 main cooldowns that we're going to have is Power Infusion if you're taking that talent, which you probably will be for raiding, and then Shadow Fiend. These 2 cooldowns, while they do have separate timings, Power Infusion is 2 minutes, Shadow Fiend is 3 minutes, you kind of want to use them together to get the most synergy out of those. Shadow Fiend scales its damage with haste. It doesn't give us insanity or anything like that, like Mindbender does, but the more haste you have, the more melees Shadow Fiend does, and this can ramp up quite significantly as the fight goes on. So, with that being said, you're going to want to use Power Infusion as close to 20 stacks as you can. in void form. When I say stacks, that's pretty much every second you're in void form you'll have a stack. This does get modified by the legendary shoulders, so keep that in mind. If you have those, you can delay this out a bit more, just not by a whole lot. So around 20 stacks, that's about when you want to target your power infusion, especially for your opener. So let's say in this situation you cast power infusion at 20 seconds or 20 stacks. 12 seconds, or sorry, when there's 12 seconds remaining on power infusion, that's when you want to cast Shadow Fiend. Shadow Fiend has a duration of 12 seconds, so that means if you cast it when power infusion has 12 seconds left, it'll have the most haste for the duration, assuming you're staying in void form the whole time. If you know you're not going to stay in, you can cast a little earlier, and this also means you can use this with Bloodlust as well. So like let's say you have a Bloodlust that expires in 15 seconds, but you haven't even popped power infusion yet. If you're getting really close to that 20-second mark, what I would usually do is at 12 seconds left in Bloodlust, I would cast Power Infusion and Shadow Fiend at the same time to get the most haste benefit out of it. And that's just kind of something you want to take into account, casting Shadow Fiend with the most haste possible for that point. Alright, so with that being said, that kind of covers most of the rotation. I'm going to go ahead and go over your opener real quick, which is actually pretty straightforward. I think I covered most of it already. For any fight, you're going to want to open with Mind Blast as out of void form. That's going to be our most insanity generated ability. And then right after that, you're going to put your dots up on the target, just like the priority list says. And then your goal is to get in void form as fast as you can. For a lot of people, this is around without, with less than certain things, this can change a little bit, but this will be anywhere between 10 and 15 seconds, something like that. And then as soon as you get into void form, what I prefer to do is to do one filler spell, which could be whatever you have available, then Void Bolt, and then Void Torrent. That way you just get your dots refreshed immediately if it took you too long to get in or whatnot. And then after your Void Torrent goes up, or expires, then you're kind of just delaying using your cooldowns until things start to get out of hand. So this usually means Power Infusion around 20 stacks, and then you're going to Shadow Fiend 8 seconds into Power Infusion. Or like I said before, when there's 12 seconds remaining on Bloodlust. And that's pretty much our opener. The rest of the fight is you getting back in and out of void form, and that is about it. Alright, so one thing I'll cover real quick, that rotation pretty much covered everything to do with Legacy of the Void, doesn't really change much. With Shadow Crash, this is kind of something we're still figuring out exactly what the best thing to do here is, but in general you can pretty much use Shadow Crash on cooldown. Now there's a big caveat to that. You don't want to use Shadow Crash on cooldown if it's like an AoE fight. So like let's say it's a fight like Spellblade where there are ads coming out at certain times and you know when they're coming. Well, if Shadow Fiend's off cooldown and those ads come out in 5 seconds, you should delay casting Shadow Crash until those ads come out. That would be a DPS gain to do that. Otherwise, you'd be casting it on just one target. And that's pretty much the only real difference with Shadow Crash is you just want to time it to make sure you're getting the most optimal uses out of it, judging by how many targets are up. You gotta be careful though because it has a 30-second cooldown, so you obviously don't want to wait 30 seconds to cast it, otherwise you would have been able to do it twice. That's pretty much the only real thing that the Shadow Crash rotation changes here. Now, the last thing that I'm going to cover real quick is Surrender to Madness. So like I said, you're not really taking this on many fights, but the idea here is quite similar. You're going to want to use your abilities in the same priority that I gave you before, with the one added guy of Dispersion. So Dispersion here can be used kind of as a delaying or getting cooldowns to come back off faster, essentially. Because what Dispersion does, it's just pausing your Insanity Drain. This isn't really effective in Legacy or Shadow Crash builds in most cases, but in Surrender, you can use Dispersion after your first Void Torrent to kind of delay things as much as possible, and then eventually get a second Dispersion later on in the fight. And usually this is going to look like, if it's pure single target, you're going to get around 100 stacks or so with Surrender as a goal. Probably 90 to 100 is more realistic. And then on multiple targets, it kind of scales out of hand, so it's hard to really say for sure, but they can last longer on multiple targets. So that being said, I don't have a timeline like I did in my last video because we're still, like I said, figuring out a lot of this stuff. But the idea is you want to use Power Infusion as late as possible. That part still remains the same, and casting Shadow Fiend in Power Infusion still remains the same, so take that with a grain of salt. Generally speaking, I would say you want to delay Power Infusion as close to 70 to 80 stacks as you can. Might have to pop it earlier if it's pure single target or whatnot, or depending on when you have lust, but that's kind of my basic guideline. Like I said, surrender isn't totally mandatory anymore, so I don't know if I'd really recommend taking it unless you are super confident with it and that kind of thing, because Legacy and Shadow Crash both can pull pretty insane numbers without the surrender build. Alright, so now that we've covered the rotation, the next thing I want to talk about is just gearing and general for Shadow Priest stuff. So the first thing that hasn't changed is the artifact path, which I'll put up now. Graphic is credit from Melgain from the How to Priest guide. And we're still going to essentially follow this. I know a lot of you that have been playing Shadow probably have your artifact well above and beyond all the traits, and you're getting your Paragon traits now, or maybe you're almost there. But in general, this is going to be the most optimal path to get DPS in a raiding environment, and this still hasn't not changed. Alright. So the next thing I want to cover is relics for our artifact. This is something I kind of skipped over in my last guides, but the guys at How to Priest and myself made this handy-dandy chart to help you decide when relics are an upgrade. So as you can see here, if you have a relic that gives you 3 eye levels on your weapon, it's valued extremely highly. And if that relic is being compared with, say, a Mind Blast relic, and the Mind Blast relic is a lower eye level, then that greater piece is going to be a better upgrade. That's just how it is. So the way you use this is essentially saying, if you have let's say you have a Vampiric Touch relic right now, and you get a Shadow Word Pain relic that's 1 weapon eye levels higher, what you would do is you would add the value of the Shadow Word Pain relic to the value of weapon eye level +1. And then you compare those two, see which number is bigger, and that's the relic you're going to want to use. This is for raiding environments and that kind of thing. I've been following this pretty well. The basics here is pretty similar. You want to get things that affect your dots first, and that's going to be Shadow Word Pain relics, Vampiric Touch relics, and Shadow Damage relics, coupled with, of course, just getting high eye level relics in general. Alright, so that kind of covers relics. The next thing I want to cover is gearing in general. This is actually a pretty hard topic of discussion right now with a lot of the Shadow Priests and that kind of thing. There are only 2 main things you need to have, or really want to get, in order to raid competitively as a Shadow Priest. The first one is you want about 10,000 haste. This is pretty important. It just makes rotation really fluid, and if you go below 10,000 haste, you'll see pretty negative results in damage, which just really isn't recommended in any circumstances. The second part of that is you want to get about 4k crit, or about 15% overall critical strike rating. This is kind of like the plateau where crit's value falls off when you're not taking Auspicious Spirits. If you were taking the Auspicious Spirits build, which like I said, a lot of you might want to if your crit's a little too high for now, then obviously your crit's more and above this. But as you start dropping crit, just don't go below that 4,000 or 15% mark, because then you'll start noticing some pretty bad diminishing returns on that. Now after those 2 points, your goal is to just get as much haste and mastery as you can. There isn't really a set order of that. I personally believe that haste is better than mastery up until about 12k haste. But that being said, you kind of just want to favor as much haste and mastery as you can get. Itemization isn't super good in our tier bonuses, so this is kind of something, just go with the flow on this guy. The main things to get are, like I said, 10k haste, 4k crit. The rest of this is pretty much just gravy. If you need help deciding upgrades after you have those 2 things, you can use the pawn strings below that the Theory Crafters at How to Priest worked on. They have ones for Sandland builds, Auspicious Spirits builds with Legacy of the Void. They have builds for Shadow Crash, and they also have builds for Surrender to Madness. Now the only thing Surrender to Madness gearing really changes from all of this is that instead of getting 10k haste, you really only need about 9,000 haste instead. So that's just the biggest difference there. Everything else is just kind of a follow the weights and go from there thing. Just keep in mind, the pawn strings and the weights are assuming that you already have a good chunk of haste. So if you have 8,000 haste and the pawn string tells you, oh yeah, you should drop another 1,000 haste because that's showing as an upgrade, it can't take into account that you don't already have 10k. So kind of take all the weights with a grain of salt. You want to maintain at least 10k haste, but getting up to 12k is kind of your goal for this raid tier. All right. Hopefully that answers most of your questions. This is a pretty complicated topic, so if you have comments or questions, feel free to leave those below. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is tier. So our tier is okay. we're looking at close to a 10% damage increase from no tier to 4-piece tier. And that's including the stat budget on the pieces. If you haven't already noticed, some of the items don't exactly have the best stats for us, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't avoid them. Regardless, from my art and our testing and Howler Priest, regardless of the items that you get, equipping your sets for 2-piece and 4-piece is generally speaking always going to be an upgrade, unless the item level difference is like 15 or 20 or even higher. Then maybe it's not as, but that's kind of the idea, is like kind of regardless of where you're getting or which pieces you get, it's still going to be good for you, assuming the eye level is reasonably close. And that's kind of what you want to do. There isn't really this thing like get these 4 pieces of tier out of the 6, or avoid these guys, because it's hard to say that when a world of Titan Forging and War Forging exists. And more importantly, we have legendaries that take up sockets of tier. We have a cloak, we have a helm, we have shoulders, all that kind of stuff, which is already tier in and of itself. So you kind of have to go based on yours. So like for example, I have the legendary shoulders, so I can't really equip the tier shoulders as I want to use my legendary, right? So you kind of go off of that for your sake. But I will say, if you want help targeting things, the 2 pieces you want to quote-unquote avoid would be the gloves and the cloak. But if you have one of those legendaries in those slots, you're going to have to use one of them. Which one you use is kind of up to you and what your current gear has. So like let's say you have a really good cloak equipped right now. Well, maybe it's better to take the gloves instead because you have that good cloak, or vice versa. So those are kind of decisions you have to make, and hopefully that helps you make that decision a little bit easier. Alright, and then as far as trinkets go, I've covered other trinkets in the past. For the most part, they pretty much stayed the same. You want to get, stat stick trinkets are really good, and there are 2 good trinkets in Nighthold for us as well, until something gets reworked or that kind of thing. The first one is the Chromatic Anomaly trinket, or Erratic Metronome, rather. And the other one is the Whispers trinket off of Gul'dan. Both of these trinkets are pretty solid overall, and I would recommend even using both if you can. And this doesn't change up your stat budget too much. If you have the Metronome, we've done some calculations that you can drop some haste. Again, I still wouldn't go below 10k, but subtracting from that 12k haste goal, you could lose out about 700 or so haste from that and be fine. Alright, so that pretty much covers all I want to say about with trinkets. In a world of War Forging and Titan Forging, it's hard to really say much more than that. It just kind of depends on what you get at what eye level. And the last thing I'll talk about here is legendaries. So keep it as short as I can. Legendaries aren't huge DPS increases for us in the grand scheme of things. But that being said, if you're looking to optimize yourself at best, what I've seen is, and the calculations that the team has done, is that in this order the legendaries kind of perform the best. Shoulders, then wrists, then the legendary cloak that was just added, and then pretty much everything else is after that, including Prides, including the belt, Cephas, all that kind of stuff is kind of all lumped together for me, just because those are more utility based things. Yes, I know the belt's down there, but you really only see that shine on single target fights, which aren't super prevalent right now in the Nighthold. So if you don't have the shoulders and cloak, kind of just use what you prefer. Like Prides is really nice because the stats are great. You get a nice shield if you're doing progression. That can be really helpful. A lot of people like Norganon's, the boots, because it's kind of nice for movement heavy stuff. So kind of just go off of that. But other than that, shoulders, wrists are kind of your top 2 go-to guys. Alright guys, and the last thing I'm going to cover in this video is just in general add-ons and weak ores that I use to help me play my class, and those that I recommend people get. The first one is weak ores in general, probably the best add-on that I've personally ever used. You can see my screen in the center here has a lot of different add-ons that help me track different things. All of my weak ores can be found in a post in the description. There's also plenty of others out there like Twin Top's Insanity Bar that I highly recommend as well. And in general, these are things I recommend everyone use. It just makes the game a little bit easier in a way. You can see things without having to check your bar, your buffs all in different places. You can kind of center all these things in your screen so you can focus on the center and where the action is happening and that kind of thing. The other 2 things I'll use that I'll highlight here that are helpful to play a Shadow Priest is a unit frame add-on. I'm using shadowed unit frames. You can see my player health bar, my target bar, and I have boss frames on the side as well. That's all shadowed unit frames, and it helps me track my dots and those things and those targets. And the last thing I'd recommend is some kind of a nameplate add-on. So that's when you are targeting an enemy or hovering over an enemy, you see their health bar above them with your dots and that kind of thing, which is super helpful for Shadow Priests. And I'm personally been using Tidy Plates now for a little while. Others to name are KUI nameplates or Plater, and there's a few other ones as well. So those are the three big types of add-ons or add-ons that I use that I recommend all of you guys try and use. I'm going to have some kind of a UI walkthrough video coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. But guys, that pretty much wraps up for this video. I hope you've learned something about the spec. If something changes, as we get closer and closer to, end of Mythic progression and whatever else, I'll make a new guide or new video or what else to cover those. But that pretty much covers everything for now. If you have questions, I'll just want to highlight a few things. I do try to answer as many of the comment questions as I can. And the other thing is I'm pretty active in the How to Priest Discord and the How to Priest website, both of which can be linked down below. I try to help as many people as I can on a daily basis, so if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer those there as well. Alright guys, that about does it for me here. If you have suggestions for other videos, you can also leave those in the comment below, and I will get to what I can. Alright, thanks.